Hola, muy buenas.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to this conversation today. My name is Raquel and I'm the director of Bamba, and I wanted to share with you how grateful we are. Thank you, Fundación Económica, for making this event possible, for having brought Heather Clark from New York to Madrid. Thank you, Heather, first of all, for having written this monumental piece of work and devoted to Sylvia Plath. For us, this is the ultimate biography. And obviously, thank you, Julia Vigio and Grupo Domino, for this wonderful translation into Spanish. This has been a magnificent work. And also in Martín Rodrigo for spending this afternoon with us, for being with us today to talk about one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. I hope you all enjoy it, and thank you all for coming. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us here today on this summerly Wednesday in this space from Espacio Fundación Telefónica. We have today in our hands a great event. We can pay homage to the work and life of Sylvia Plath, as the editor of Bamba has just said, is one of the greatest female writers of the 20th century. Also, we are doing this today based on the wonderful biography written by Heather Clark, who is here with us today, and which has been published by Bamba Publishing House. And also we have the two translators of this immense biography due to its value, and also it's huge in terms of length. It's more than 1,000 pages, and we will talk about the work of translating this magnificent work. So thank you, Julia Viejo and Gudrun Palomino, for being here with me today in order to pay homage to Sylvia Plath. Thank you to the three of you. Also, thanks to the editors of Bamba for making this possible. Please allow me to say that Heather Clark is one of the greatest experts in the world in the works and also in the life, or maybe I should name Sylvia Plath's life first. Her biography, published by Bamba, which has a title of Red Comet, has been acknowledged as the best biography of the year by the New York Times and also by the British newspaper The Guardian, and it has also been finalist for the Pulitzer Prize on the Critics Award. And Heather Clark's name is very much connected to Sylvia Plath due to the great amount of work that she has published on her. She has a degree in philology in English language by the University of Oxford. She tells us about Sylvia Plath in this biography, but she doesn't talk about the myth. I would say that this is the ultimate biography for all us readers who love Sylvia Plath. We really needed this biography, and the wait has been worth the while. It includes all the letters that have been kept written by Sylvia Plath, and it is also based on her unpublished journals, and also it's based on her creative pieces of work and all the things that she had published. What Heather does is show us her life in full, and also point out all the great events that marked this wonderful writer's life, from the first relationships that she had to the time when she made the decision of not becoming a conventional housewife, and all the conflicts that she had to go through because she didn't know about mental health. So I would like to start by asking you, Heather, several questions regarding where this masterpiece came about. Why? Why did you write this? Why did you write The Red Comet?
Everyone for coming here, and to thank Bamba Press for publishing this book, and thank you to Julia and Gudrun, my wonderful translators who I just met today, and thank you, Inez, for coming. It's really a pleasure to be in Madrid and speak about Sylvia Plath, I should say. I feel like I'm speaking to her sometimes. I felt that way for 8 years while I was writing the book. So, ¿por qué? Yes. I think my biography is the 11th biography of Sylvia Plath. So this was a question that came up a lot, right? Why do we need another biography of Sylvia Plath? And I'm a scholar, I'm an academic, I teach post-war poetry, and it bothered me that when I was teaching classes on Sylvia Plath, I didn't have a biography that I felt I could assign to my students that I felt was thorough and comprehensive and fair. A lot of the biographies were, well, they were very short, and I felt like they pathologized her in some way. They would start with her suicide in some cases, and there was a suggestion that she was sort of on this trajectory for suicide, and I wanted to reframe that and sort of try to rewrite the conversation and to treat her as an ambitious, determined writer and to focus on her literary journey. I felt like her name had become synonymous with madness and tragedy and suicide, frankly, when I started the book. And that just seemed, it made me angry because I feel like she's one of the most important writers of the 20th century, and I felt like she deserved a big book that treated her as such, that treated her seriously. And my model was Hermione Lee's biography of Virginia Woolf. So I always had that in the back of my mind. And there's a quote that I read by Hermione Lee on biography. And she says that often women whose lives have involved mental illness, suicide, self-harm, abuse, are often treated biographically as psychological case histories first and professional writers second. And so for me, when I read that quote, I thought, oh, that's Sylvia Plath. I really felt strongly that's what happened to Sylvia Plath. So that idea of treating her as a professional writer first, that's what drove me to try to sell this biography to publishers, even though it was number 11.
Es verdad que hay muchos casos que...
It's true that there are many cases, such as that of Sylvia Plath, for instance, that of Anne Sexton, where all these types of mental health episodes, those crises that she experienced, and the fact that she also ended her life with committing suicide, actually blur the rest of their lives, and it's as if they casted a very long shadow on everything else that their lives entailed and all their work. I am very interested in the working process. I would also like to ask you, Julia, Gudrun, how you tackled this type of work, this translation, and how you decided to take on this challenge. But Heather, before that, I think you were working for 8 years on this biography. So how was it? How was that process of committing yourself fully for 8 years to this work? How did you approach all the sources, all the files? What do you remember from that very long period that you devoted to Sylvia Plath's life?
So I should have mentioned that another reason I decided it was a good time to write a biography of Sylvia Plath was because there was a lot of new material. Sylvia Plath's collected letters were going to be published in 2018, and I knew that was happening. Ted Hughes had left his papers to the British Library, and Emory University in the year 2000, and I knew there was more. There was more there in Ted Hughes's papers, so there was quite a bit of new material, and yeah, I mean, it was a long process. I spent weeks in archives, just going through, taking photos of thousands of pieces of paper, and then I would bring that home so I could look at it all on my computer. But Sylvia Plath left such a paper trail. It's possible to know what she was doing on almost every day of her life. I mean, it is the paper trail that she left, and her mother kept everything. So my problem was that actually I had too much information. And there's a saying in English, I don't know if you have it in Spanish, but trying to find a needle in a haystack. It was like a haystack in a haystack, you know? It was like too much. So how did I figure out what to prioritize out of all these thousands of letters and manuscripts? And by the way, there's a lot of unpublished material still by Sylvia Plath in the archives, a lot. So when I would get overwhelmed in the archive, I would just ask myself, okay, focus. How did Sylvia Plath become the writer that she became? And that was my one question. When I would start to just feel like I had too much information, I was too overwhelmed by what I was looking at. There were quite a few people who had never spoken about Plath before and who decided it was the right time. Passions had cooled over 50 years. She died in 1963, so the stakes were a little bit lower. I think that people were starting to worry Plath was being forgotten a bit. And also, it was a better time to write about Sylvia Plath because it was easier to get permission. Her daughter ran the estate instead of Ted Hughes' sister, so that helped matters as well. But it was a long process, but I felt very lucky to do the work. I mean, every morning I woke up and I really looked forward to it. I felt it was a privilege to be able to write this book, and I loved it.
Gudrun, Julia, también.
Gudrun, Julia, do you feel in some way, what Heather is talking about, was it a privilege to be able to translate the biography of Sylvia Plath? If you don't mind, Gudrun, we're going to start by Julia, who is by my side. Yes, of course. In the beginning, you accept a project that arrives at your desk, thinking that it's a book, a biography, an essay, and then you realize that this is not a standard biography. It's about a writer and also a poet, and that in this biography you will see poems that have been translated and published and not published, and you really feel overwhelmed to a certain extent. And so, at least for me, that was how I felt. I felt at the beginning very excited about it, and then I felt overwhelmed, and then I felt very happy about it, despite all the obstacles, the challenges that we found due to the originals, because the text is a sort of generic text, not without any sort of difficulties as such, and it's very entertaining. It's a very entertaining writing. But then we have the poems, the writings by Sylvia, and she wrote everything, as Heather has pointed out, and that was much more difficult. And also the cultural references that were included. I see. So this was an added difficulty. It was not only the essay that you were translating, but also a creative translation, because you have not only translated Heather's work, but you have also translated Sylvia Plath. This is a great responsibility, isn't it, Gudrun? Indeed, it was. At the beginning, I felt very honored honored and very happy to be able to participate in this project. Also, I'm working on my doctoral thesis on Sylvia's work, so this meant that I had to be with Sylvia spent with Sylvia all my days, from the moment I woke up to the time I went to bed. I feel she is almost my friend. She is Sylvia in my mind because I've spent so much time with her up until now. But I have the same feeling that Julia was explaining. At the beginning, I started crying. I couldn't believe I was going to translate this. But then I had to sit down and tell myself, well, we need to face these hundreds and hundreds of pages that we have to translate, and this is a work that won't be done by itself. But at the same time, I knew that when I was going to work with Julia, she was going to give me a lot of peace of mind. And working with Heather was already an honor, but also, as you have said, we had unpublished poems by Sylvia. We had unpublished letters, unpublished fragments from her journals. Also, we divided the translation into two parts, and I got many unpublished poems by her husband. And so it was a challenge to me, and it was also an honor. I myself write poetry, but translating poetry is a totally different animal. And one of the times that I had to face one of these translations of poetries had to do with translating unpublished poems by Sylvia, and it was a real challenge to me and a real honor. And I'm very happy also to be here today, because translators are never mentioned, or not usually mentioned. And I do not know if we had to wait for a 1,400 pages book to receive this acknowledgement. Well, to translate is to write as well, and translators are creators just as much as a writer. So I think we should welcome this visibility of these two wonderful translators that we have here on stage, Gudrun and Julia. Julia, Gudrun has mentioned that you split the work. How did you do this? I'm very interested in this. How can you divide the translation of a work that is 1,400 pages long, and that is sort of a treasure full of wonderful gems? So you would be lucky with any part. So how did you organize your work? Well, we just took a sort of a metaphorical sword and split it into two. I arrived in the project first, and I got the first part, and it deals with the youth and the childhood of Sylvia, with many poems from that period of her life. And it's wonderful, marvelous to see the evolution of her style from one poem to the next, and all these little wonders that she already wrote when she was 9 or 10 years old. And you can see the influence of every play that she sees, with every book that she reads. And I was lucky to get to the first part. Also, Gudrun loves the second part, so we were agreed at all times in this split. There was a lot of communication between us in order to unify the terminology or the titles of the poems, etc. But it was such a huge project that we really needed to work hand in hand and divide it into two. So, well, just I have a curiosity. If it took Heather 8 years to write the biography, how long did it take you to translate it? It was 5 months, more or less. We delivered the last bit in July, and then we had a very thorough revision and editing part that came after that. I will ask this also to you, but I would like to ask Heather first. What did you find about Sylvia Plath, that you didn't know before and after you spent 8 years of your life with her?
You know, for me, I think it was more who she was. I suppose I had an understanding of her when I started this project, that maybe I had bought into the Plath myth. a little bit, right? And I didn't realize quite how strong, disciplined, ambitious, determined, willful she was. How productive, what a work ethic she had. She was such a strong person and overcame so much, and I didn't quite realize that. And I think part of what I learned about her was that she scaled so many barriers put in front of her. It was 1950s America, right? And ambitious women were not necessarily encouraged, especially ambitious women artists. And, it was, women were supposed to marry after they went to college and have children and run the family, run the home. And, it was the idea of the nuclear family was very important at that time. And in fact, in my prologue, I quote a speech that the presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson gave at Smith College in 1955, this is where Sylvia Plath graduated, an all-women's, very, very fancy, famous all-women's college. And in his graduation speech, he told them that they should all be happy to go become humble housewives. So this was the world Sylvia Plath was graduating into. So to achieve what she did, I think she was very brave and determined. And for me, the story sort of became not so much about her depression, her battles with depression and mental illness, although that was a very important part of the story, and I didn't want to ignore it. But it was, I sort of followed her theme because the story she tells about herself in her letters and her journals is how, the story of becoming a writer. Writing was her true vocation. It was her true north. And she had this ambition from the time she was 8 years old. So Sylvia Plath sort of led me in the direction that I think she wanted to go in. So really I felt like I got to know her better. I made a mental note to myself not to use words like neurotic, fragile, doomed, hysterical, obsessed. Just those words, that language, it was very important to me not to do that. In terms of something I didn't know that was factual, I would say the drugs that she was on at the end of her life. So, as you two know, there was new information about sort of the last month of Sylvia Plath's life, and she had a doctor who prescribed her antidepressants and some other medications, and we don't know what effect these had really on her. They could have made her worse. So there were new medical records that I think complicated the story, and that. I suppose that sort of changed the way that I thought about her suicide.
Y por tanto,
Let me see.
no.
So, in a certain way, her suicide, do you think, could have been avoided?
Oh, I mean, it's just such an open question, but I do think that some of the information I learned, it just made me at least think about the possibility that some of the cures that she was prescribed for depression may have made her worse, and especially electroshock therapy, but also some of the drugs near the end, because the interactions were not well understood at that time, and the people who knew her, they said she was acting very strangely at the end. People I talked to, she was slurring her words and almost seemed drunk quite a bit, and so we just don't know. I think she was also terrified of going into another mental institution. And she was very scared that she would lose her independence and her autonomy, and that she would have electroshock therapy again. And so I think that was might have been part of the choice. Who knows? We never know. But Yeah.
Gudrun, Julia, la misma pregunta.
Gudrun, Julia, I want to ask you the same question I asked Heather. What opinion or who was Sylvia Plath for you before this work, before starting this translation, and how would you define her now? Well, I think we both had a different idea of who she was. I have to admit, I had in my mind the cliche of this doomed poet, this sick person, and the myth. And to me, this has really changed my view on Sylvia Plath. I had read The Bell Jar and other things from her, but that literary, this myth about her was already in my mind, but this book completely transforms my view on her. I think that we can see that this book brings about the most passionate part of Sylvia. This biography is full of happiness and of this passion that she had. In more than 1,000 words, you can deal with many things. She was a very dynamic, vital person, and she was always looking for that artistic flame. And this is the thing that I have learned and that has changed my view completely. This is me. Gudrun already knew her better, so she can tell you more. Yes, indeed, I knew her life a bit better. I had read the book before I started translating it, but obviously translating gives you a completely different out view of something, because when you're reading from an academic perspective, you look for certain things, but you don't follow it as a biography, as a trajectory. This is not an academic book. This is a biography that is meant for any reader without having to have a university degree, for instance. So what I found was that Sylvia was a person who is very vital, very passionate person. She died how she did because of what Heather mentions, where the drugs that she was taking might have not been working. She was mixing some codeine with some antidepressants, and we need to look at this in its context. Back in the 1960s in the United Kingdom, obviously the psychological and psychiatric treatments are not the same now as they used to be, and I already knew Sylvia Plath, and I started reading her work because of the myth, because I would say of her suicide, as many people do. But I think that you can enter her works from a different perspective, and if you read Sylvia Plath after reading this biography and after knowing her better, you would approach her work in a completely different manner. Her poems do not deal or a great number of her poems do not deal with her depression. In some of them you can see it, and in the Bell Jar she also deals with this first issue that she had in 1953 in the MacLean Hospital. But in her poems, we see that there's a person who is full of passion, who expresses satire, who has many varied interests, who talks about the nature animals, and this is like a door to entering the Sylvia Plath that was hidden inside the myth. So this gives us a new approach, a very vital approach, and to understand her as a writer rather than a person who committed suicide.
Heather, do you think that the public in general, readers of Sylvia Plath, but the public in general, do we know who she was? Is there still a certain amount of lack of knowledge? Are we based on prejudice and the myth that we were talking about before?
Yeah, I think things are better now. I think when I started writing the biography 10 years ago. Oh God, more than 12 years ago now. Took me about 8 years. I think it was much worse. And that was part of what drove me to write the biography, just simply because I was angry. I felt like male writers who die by suicide were not defined by their suicide, you know, like Ernest Hemingway and Hart Crane and David Foster Wallace and those people. I felt like Sylvia Plath was. So, and Anne Sexton as well, to a certain extent. So 10 years ago, I did feel there was a lack of knowledge and a kind of tendency to pathologize Sylvia Plath. And there was all of this brilliant scholarship being written by people in the field, and I felt like, you know, academics were treating her in a different way than she was being sort of regarded in the popular imagination. So lots of academics were writing about Sylvia Plath and irony, right? That Sylvia Plath is not the speaker in the poem, that she's using irony. There are different modes in which she writes. It's not all confessional. And when she is confessional, you know, maybe she's lying, maybe she's... So I wanted some of that scholarship to kind of... I was trying to translate it, I suppose, translate some of those brilliant ideas into a book that I hoped anyone could read. And I think over the years, some of that has trickled down, you know, into the popular imagination, not because of me, but just the Me Too movement in America and things like that, just a bit more respect for women writers in the past decade. So I think things have changed, absolutely, for the better. But when I was writing this book, a lot of people made jokes about Sylvia Plath's death. And, you know, you would be surprised by how many jokes I got about it. And, you know, the way in which she died, you know, by carbon monoxide poisoning. And so that doesn't happen anymore, which is good.
At least.
Yeah. So, but I think that there is more of an understanding now that Sylvia Plath is one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, right? Not even one of the greatest women writers or American writers, but one of the greatest writers. And that, for me, that was the point of my book. I just wanted people to take her seriously as a great writer who changed poetry in English. So I think it is better now. I hope. Thanks to you two as well.
Thank
you. No one wants to translate this book because it's, you know,
We want
3,000 pages.
We wanted
No,
to.
I know. Yeah.
Julia, Gudrun, ¿vosotros creéis?
Julia, Gudrun, do you think that we will manage to demythify the writer, to get rid of the myth, and to see the woman behind this myth, the true Sylvia Plath? Well, I think the answer is yes. This is why we have these biographies, these events, when we talk about her. As Heather was saying, we are deconstructing this myth. We are showing this brilliant author, thanks to feminist movements, thanks to more critical gaze and more focus on mental illnesses, more information, because before, there were difficult and unjust situations suffered by many people, and I do think that Heather Clark's biography is an excellent starting point, quite amazing. But also, I think that we are being more critic towards these myths in the press, with the publication of the biography. We're talking about all of this more. I think we will achieve it, and it's what Heather was saying. If we have male authors who are not described or marked by their suicide. I think we can achieve this with Sylvia, thanks to this biography. I think it's important to share her work. We're talking about her life because this is a biography, but I'm hopeful. I see this in social media. This is a little bit it allows us to see what's happening and how we're talking about her life, her studies, and this is what should remain. Who she married, and this is part of her life, her work, but it's easier for us to understand her. But we have to continue sharing her work. Here in Spain, we haven't read her that much due to this myth, death by suicide, but maybe her poetry hasn't been as well known or as popular, but little by little I think this is improving, and it brings me hope, and I think she'd like this too. Ted Hughes. That large shadow next to her. Heather, how did he influence her life and her work? Her relationship with Ted Hughes, which
biography so long is because Ted Hughes is a big part of it. They were married for almost 7 years, and they both wanted to change British and American poetry. They felt it was too genteel. That was the word they used quite often. Too small, too precious. They wanted to introduce a bolder note into English poetry, more raw, more honest, and more violent, I should say, too. I mean, their models were W.B. Yeats, D.H. Lawrence. They loved Robert Graves. So when they met, it was sort of like this merging of forces, because they both had very similar ideas about where they thought British and American poetry should go. So they had this aesthetic foundation that they built the marriage on. And you know, we all know the end of the story. The end of the marriage was terrible and destructive. But the early years were actually quite idyllic. They would give each other time and space to work. She usually worked in the mornings, and then he worked in the afternoons. And when they had children, they split the childcare 50-50. So she would again work in the morning. He would take the baby for walks in the pram. And a lot of people I interviewed said they couldn't believe Ted Hughes was out pushing a baby stroller in 1961, because men didn't do that in London in 1961.
But he did.
Yeah, but he did.
Okay.
And her friends always mentioned that, and that he would change the diapers, So this was actually quite progressive for 1960. In terms of literary influence, she helped introduce him to American poetry. Mm-hmm. I think he helped introduce her in a deeper way to current British poetry. And they read each other's work. They read everything. I mean, you can go to the archive and you can see Ted Hughes' handwriting on Sylvia Plath's poems and vice versa. So they were each other's first readers. And I think that he helped her. I think she was a bit nervous about writing in this bolder way, maybe because she was a woman, actually. And that he, and also Robert Lowell and Anne Sexton, sort of gave her permission to explore these subjects that were considered taboo. That was Plath's word, taboo. Like mental illness, like suicide attempts, like mental hospitals, but also motherhood and childbirth and miscarriage and pregnancy, which, hadn't really been, there weren't many poems about those things in the late 1950s by American poets. A few, but not much. So I think she was able to access deeper parts of her he would say her unconscious. He tried to sort of help her unlock that. Yeah.
Acabas de hablar también de...
You just talked about her role as a mother. You've mentioned maternity, motherhood. To be able to publish the book, you needed the consent from her daughter, from Frida. How was Sylvia Plath's relationship with her children? What was her relationship with motherhood? I think this is really present in her biography.
So Sylvia Plath is a poet who has spoken to me at different parts of my life. And I've heard this from many readers as well, that when you're 15 and you read Sylvia Plath for the first time, you read Daddy and it's so exciting and it's shocking and new. And then, later when I had children, I sort of felt like her poetry, her poems were some of the only poems that were honest about how beautiful it was, but how difficult it was as well. I really felt there was an honesty in her poems about motherhood and children, and I appreciated that because it's a subject in America that is still very treated with a lot of sentimentality. So for her, and also she read a poem about miscarriage on the BBC in 1961. And this was a time when the word pregnant was not allowed on American television.
Almost forbidden.
Yeah. And she read a poem about miscarriage on the BBC. I mean, so I think the bravery she had in giving voice to women's experiences and women's lives and all these things that weren't supposed to be talked about, that they were shameful and secret. And she said, no, this is the stuff of poetry. I want to write about what it's like to wake up at 4 a.m. and feed my infant, and I want to write about the decisions that went into deciding to have a child, this sort of thing. So she gave voice to that, and I really appreciate that as a mother myself. But she also gave voice to female anger, which also was not really considered a poetic subject at the time. Anyone who's read Lady Lazarus and Daddy, she sort of introduced female anger into the poetic lexicon in a way. So she loved her children. She loved them very much. That's clear as day to me. She always wrote about her deep, deep love for her children, and there's several poems which express that. But she also suffered from depression, and depression took her life. And so, I think, and I write about this in the book, and again, I just want to preface saying, who knows? Who knows what went into the decision, but I think she felt like she would be such a burden on her children. If she was going into a mental hospital, that she would lose her independence, she was going to have shock therapy again. She thought she was losing her mind at the end. And that her children would actually be better off with her brother. And she was ashamed, she was humiliated by what was happening to her, and I think she felt like she was a burden to them. And so it was a very, the end of the book was extremely difficult to write, and about, leaving these very young children, 1 and 3. And it took me a long time to kind of decide how I was going to deal with that. But again, I just kept coming back to the idea depression killed Sylvia Plath. But I don't think there was any question. She loved her children.
Para ya ir cerrando y dar paso.
We're going to give the floor to our readers here, to the public. But before that, Julia Gudrum. It is true that approaching her work here in Spain, the focus is still slightly distant. It is changing, but, the bell jar is known, but little more. there's a lack of knowledge in general, I would say, due to what we were saying just now. This myth that is above anything else. And I would like you to encourage a reader that hasn't read Sylvia Plath. What would you highlight? Of course, through Heather's biography, what should they start with in her work? I think it's a nice way of ending this conversation. In Red Comet, there are many poems, and I think it's the best way of starting. If you don't really know anything about her, it's an excellent starting point. Sylvia published a novel, only one a nuance published, The Bell Jar, and two groups of poems, The Colossus and Ariel, and others, and different compendiums. But I'd say Ariel maybe after this. Honestly, I don't know, because Ariel is full of complex poems. As Heather was saying, Lady Lazarus, Daddy, have to do with that myth, how that cat dies 7 times, that depression, the poet sharing his story or life, and the poet, as we know, is also a liar, so to speak. But I don't know if I would start with Ariel. Maybe I'd start with The Bell Jar. I think it gives you a vision on the 50s. And we haven't said this, but on filming this platform, there's a documentary, The Bell Jar, with Heather's participation, and this is also an excellent recommendation. I think I would encourage readers to read Ariel. It is her masterpiece, and she reminds herself that she's writing the best poems of her life, but maybe for a reader who's not really used to poetry, I'm not sure if Ariel is the best. There's also a criticism towards psychiatry, about how women were treated. It might be better to start with The Bell Jar and watch the documentary, definitely. These poems, well, you have the English and Spanish versions, and it's the full publication of all poems. So if this is also a call to action, maybe somebody would like to translate The Colossus. We do have the bilingual version for Ariel, but for readers who are not used to reading poems, well, I think they should all start with Red Comet, right? It's like a novel, 1,400 pages, that's it, but it's like a novel. You just read her story. It's the novel of her life, and with many sources and many notes. And once again, reality exceeds fiction, right? And as I was saying, we don't have much time. Maybe a couple of questions for Heather, Julia, and Gudrun. Heather's gonna be here afterwards signing the biographies. If you want to have your book signed. Do we have any questions? Yes, there's a hand here. Hello. First of all, thank you, Heather, for your research for this amazing book. I think it pays homage to Sylvia. You've talked about her myth, and maybe I'm wrong, but I have the impression that her children suffered this myth greatly. Have you had any feedback from Frida? What have been the consequences of the myth of their mother on the people that she knew and her surroundings?
Yeah, so sadly, so Plath had 2 children, and sadly her son also died by suicide a few years ago. And Frida's an incredible person. I mean, she knew that I was writing this book when I started. I reached out to her. She gave me permission to go to all the archives and take pictures of all of the published and unpublished manuscripts. So we were off to a good start. But she wanted to read the whole thing before she gave me permission to quote Sylvia Plath. So it was very nerve-wracking. I wrote this book, I didn't know if I would be able to quote Sylvia Plath, but I did it anyway. I just did it. And I would not do it again. I would not, that was not a good idea. Many sleepless nights. But she really, she loved it, and thank God. But she sent me, several nice letters, and she felt like it helped move her mother away from that idea of the hysterical woman writer and, the writer who's obsessed with death, and towards a kind of, I think she thought, more accurate and hopeful vision of who her mother was. And I don't want to whitewash, the fact that she suffered severely from depression, and I tried to deal with the mental illness thoroughly in the book because it was a big part of her life. And I think she wrote some of the most beautiful poems about depression in the English language. So it's not like I'm trying to pretend that didn't happen, but I think she felt like that had been the story. That had been the whole story. And I was telling the story about how she became a writer, which was all she ever really wanted to do. So no, but yeah, she's really an amazing person, and I admire her. She's been through a lot.
¿Más preguntas?
Any more questions? Hello, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for this biography. For readers and non-readers, I'm sure we will discover it. I wanted to ask you about the title, why Red Comet, for this compendium of letters and all her work, her life.
So it's actually a longer story, the story of the title. My first title was The Light of the Mind, A Life of Sylvia Plath. And I really liked that title because it had the word light and mind in it. And it's the first line of The Moon and the Yew Tree. This is the light of the mind, cold and planetary, which I think is one of the best lines in English. So that, that mindscape of depression, that psychic mindscape, she was trying to conjure that. But my editor said, no, it's too long. We want something bold. And so Red Comet comes from Sylvia Plath's poem Stings. Yeah, would you like to read it? Maybe.
I mean, I can read it.
Yeah, why don't you read in Spanish? Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
So, le estaba comentando a Heather que la.
I was telling Heather that in the Spanish version, the poem is here. I can read it. I'll read it in Spanish.
Valía la pena, pero tengo un yo que recuperar, una reina. ¿Estará muerta o solo dormida? ¿Dónde se habrá metido con su cuerpo rojo león y sus alas de cristal? Ahora está volando, más temible que nunca. Roja cicatriz en el cielo. Cometa rojo sobre el motor que la mató. El mausoleo. La casa de cera. That's it.
Yes. Thank you for reading. Thank you.
¿Más preguntas?
Any more questions? Hello, good afternoon. Thank you to the four of you. It's been very interesting, and I wanted to ask Heather, what's her opinion on having women? You talked about women such as Virginia Woolf, who committed suicide. If there's a burnout in women who have to fight against everything to have the same level of acknowledgement, and maybe this burnout leads to an imbalance and then leads to these kind of problems. In many cases, women writers, musicians, artists who have had to fight so much, and maybe I wouldn't say that it is the cause, but maybe it would be an accelerator of this mental conflict. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I think it's something that, frankly, those of us who study these women writers, we've all thought about that. Yeah, that, you know, what in terms of the sexism that they always had to fight against, you know, sort of constantly throwing themselves up against these walls, these barriers, and working twice as hard. What effect did that have? What effect did the environment have on their mental health? And I'm sure it did have an effect. I mean, it's just hard to speculate. So Sylvia Plath, signs of her depression began fairly early when she was a teenager. You can see it. You can see things in her letters, and she sort of self-diagnoses. She says, my life is running on two parallel currents. One is very high, one's very low. And so she kind of examines herself throughout her life. But yeah, I mean, you do wonder. You wonder how much of it is genetic, is environmental, it's just very hard. It's hard to know. Anne Sexton as well. I'm working on a biography of Anne Sexton right now too. So this is another question that comes up. Yeah, no, they did have to work harder, absolutely. But when I was writing this book, I was always very aware that I was not a doctor. So I was always quite reluctant to speculate. I was not a psychiatrist. But I definitely see your point. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, and if not, we will just move on to the signing of the biography. It seems that no. Yes? Good afternoon. How do you decide what to not include in the book when you have so much material? And a question for the three of you. Sometimes the bell jar is compared with
Han sido muy buenos amigos. No sé.
The Guardian in the Hay. Would you agree with this? Can we compare these two books?
So my manuscript was almost 2,000 pages.
2,000?
Yes. And we had to cut a lot. My husband helped me do some of that. Thank you, Nathan. Mostly from the beginning, from the first half. And then my editor also helped me. She said we had to get it under 1,000 pages without notes. But, I give a lot of credit to my editor because most editors would not have been okay with a 1,000-page book. But she felt like Sylvia Plath deserved it, and I felt like that too. I wanted Sylvia Plath to take up space on the bookshelf. You know, I wanted her to have that 3-inch spine. I really, really did. And so, yeah, I did have to cut several hundred pages, but they're all up in my attic. It was, yeah, mostly from the beginning. I felt like I didn't want to cut the section from the second half of her life because that was the section that was most important to her work. So yeah, it was mostly childhood sections that I cut. I don't know if you two want to take the Catcher in the Rye question.
Me ha gustado la comparación, sí.
That parallelism is good. I agree. It would have been nice to see Holden's character with. I'm not sure about this. If we can compare these two books, we'll never be able to do so. But it would be good to imagine in the 50s in New York. I'm not sure if Esther Greenwood love-hate. I'd say love-hate. Due to their personalities, they're both love-hate, but they both have a lot of sense of humor. They're ironic, and they criticize the world that they live in. So maybe they would end up fighting. I'm not sure. Well, with this fictitious comparison between Salinger and Sylvia Plath, we can wrap up. I think, well, it's great to do so like this. Thank you to Heather, to Gudrun and Julia for this great conversation on Sylvia Plath. All the best for Bamba Publishing House, and I hope they will also publish the book that Heather's working on now. And hope you enjoy Red Comet, and thank you to everyone, and let's be in touch.